Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Take Your Shot podcast. Today we're sitting down with Nikki Roush, and she is an expert when it comes to sales, like all things sales. And I know what you're thinking, sales maybe sounds a little bit scary, but today we're going to debunk that. We're going to talk all about the ins and outs, common mistakes, things that you maybe didn't know, or just ways to rethink that. And so I want you to stick with us today. We're going to dive in. And so Nikki, welcome aboard. If you don't mind introducing yourself, telling our listeners a little bit more about who you are, what you do, that would be awesome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation. So I am the Sales Maven. That's the name of my company. I'm the CEO of the company, and we've been in business now for 11 years. And I primarily teach women business owners how to have more effective sales conversations. I have a pretty extensive background in corporate sales, and I have an extensive background in neuro-linguistic programming. So when I decided to start my business, it was this idea of really wanting to help women make a bigger impact. And I know that one of the ways that you can make a big impact is by actually bringing revenue into your business. And that means being able to sell. So I teach people really the step-by-step process of how to have an effective sales conversation. And I do that I have a signature framework that's a 5-step process to a successful sales conversation. And so the whole point is allowing people to be their authentic self in the conversation, but also knowing like, where are you going and how do you get there?
I love how you just talked about too, just like being your authentic self, because I think so often people think sales and like the sleazy car salesman, right? And like, that's not us, that's how we're doing. And I think, to really just like reframe our thoughts around sales, to be able to like have it feel natural, have it feel like you, but also just like, because you're genuinely passionate about the thing that you're offering, and more people are going to benefit when they get that in their hands, or the experience that you provide. And so just to kind of start things off, I would love to hear a little bit more about like, what would you say are kind of the biggest mistakes you see people making when it comes to their approach to sales, whether that's mindset or actual things that they're doing or not doing? Like, what have you seen in your experience?
Yeah, well, one of the biggest ones is that the biggest misconception about sales is that sales or selling is something you do to another person. It isn't. It actually is something you do with another person. And so when you start approaching your sales conversations with this with attitude, you recognize your job is not to convince anybody to buy from you. Your job truly is to understand, does this person have a want or a need? Do I have a solution that would meet that want or need? And do I have permission to put this solution in front of them so that they can make an educated decision as to whether or not they're interested in us continuing the conversation, working together, buying from me, etc. So when you start kind of transforming this approach, you realize that you don't need to talk at people, because when you talk at people, they stop listening. You want to talk with people. And so that also means getting really good at asking smart questions that lead people naturally down a path to identify, oh, I'm talking to somebody who can solve my problem, meet my need, is going to deliver on the thing that I most want. And so it's not you convincing them, it's them actually convincing themselves that they're talking to the right person, that this person they're talking to can help. And you do that by asking really smart questions instead of trying to do the like dog and pony show and like convince you how great I am. Like, nobody cares how great you are. They care whether or not you have a solution that's going to match up and make a difference in their life or their business, or, depending on what you're offering. And I know with you, a lot of your listeners are photographers. So, whether it's wedding or whether it's a branding shoot or something else, but they have a desire, and your job is to show them how you can meet that.
I think that's so great. And I think it can be really overwhelming sometimes for people to even try to figure out like where to start with all of this, like where to start the conversation, where to start with like knowing the questions to ask. I know you talked a little bit about like your 5-step process. Would you be willing to tell us a little bit more about like kind of like where would you recommend starting, and like maybe walking us through a little bit of like the parts of the process?
Yeah. So my signature framework, I call it the selling staircase. I actually wrote my 3rd book around this, because I feel like when you break down a structure, it's easy for somebody to go like, oh, I can follow a structure or a step-by-step process. And I teach it as a staircase. I call it the selling staircase, because most people understand that you ascend a staircase one step at a time. You don't stand at the bottom and hop all the way to the top. And that's one of those mistakes in sales, is people like immediately go from meeting somebody to selling. That's like trying to skip all the steps. And it can be risky to do that, right? If you stand at the bottom of a staircase and try to just from a standing position hop up 5 steps, chances are, unless you have a really strong core, you might bang your shins or you might miss a step or, you might sprain your ankle. And so clients and prospective clients, they don't do that with you. They don't want you to like immediately go in for the sale. So understanding what step am I on with this person? Where are they showing up? Because sometimes somebody might show up in your business on step 3, or sometimes they show up on step 2 or step 1, right? You got to start from the beginning. Your job is to meet them where they are and then guide them up the rest of the staircase. So the 5 steps break down like this. Step 1 is introduction. And that's when somebody's being introduced to you or to your business, to what you're offering in some way. This happens on your website. This happens on social media. This happens when somebody hears you on a podcast. Like for the first time, that's that introduction piece. The objective there is to make a powerful first impression. And once you do that, it's really easy to move to step 2 in the process, which is create curiosity. This is the most missed step. Most people, if I ask them, do you know how to create curiosity? When you're talking about your business or your products or your services, they get this look like, what now? What do you mean create curiosity? But yet, if you're not able to create curiosity, people often won't go any further with you because they don't know like what's possible for them or why they would even get into a conversation with you. So your job is to be able to create curiosity. Once you do that, it's easy to move people to step 3. Now, sometimes people show up, like I said, in your business on step 3, which is discovery. Now, for some people, I call it discovery because the objective here is to discover what's going on for them. Do they have a want? Do they have a need? Do I have a solution? Do I have permission to put it in front of them? But you might call it your sales call, or you might call it your consult, or you might call it something else. I don't actually care what you call it. What I care is that is when you're asking your really smart questions. Your questions, there's kind of 2 types of questions. There's the questions that you absolutely need the answers to identify that you're talking to somebody who's a right fit. And then there are the questions that you ask that plant seeds about your expertise and what they're going to get when they work with you. So those are your expertise questions and your right fit questions. Once you do a well done discovery, it's super easy to guide somebody to the next step in the process, which is proposal. That's when you're actually selling. That's when you're laying out an offer, putting something in front of them and allowing them to choose, like, would you like to buy this? Yes or no, kind of thing. And step 4 and then step 5, they go really close together. Because when you put out your offer, when you make an offer to somebody or you put a solution in front of them, the second most missed step in the selling process is step 5, and that's the close. And when I say close, I don't necessarily mean that you're always going to like earn the business. What I mean, though, is that your job is to issue close language so that the person can make a decision to move forward with you or not. And if you're not closing, which again, I mentioned, second most missed step, a lot of people will say like, oh, I get all these like interested people. They seem totally in, and then they don't buy, they ghost me. Most of the time, those people are missing the close. They're not actually closing on the call, or at least attempting to. And because they don't get that close language out of their mouth, people don't ever make a decision to hire you. And then when they get off the phone with you or get off leave the appointment with you, the chance of you getting their attention back again is so slim because we're so bombarded with so many other things that we have to do in our lives and business that it's super hard to get their attention again. So your job is to make it really easy. Your job is to guide people through the process, and it's one step at a time.
Man, thanks for laying that out there. That's I feel like there's so much that we could like really unpack just within those. Maybe we just like kick it from the beginning. If you don't mind me just like poking a couple questions about like the things you said, because there's so much there. So okay, maybe walk us through the example, like with step 1, like what are some examples of like how to have like a really solid introduction, like using your website or using like social, like what are some things that you think are really important to not miss in that introduction stage?
Well, one is really being able to identify like that this person, if they land on your website, they should be able to identify pretty quickly whether or not they're a good fit. So instead of spending all the time talking about you and your solution, there needs to be things for them to start to go like, oh, yes, this is what I'm looking for. So it could be through asking questions like, what of these things of this bulleted list are you looking to accomplish? Or does this resonate with you? Boom, 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 bullet points. So they're starting to go like, oh, yeah, this is interesting, or this is it. And then they're willing to dig a little deeper and then look at your bio or your testimonials or whatever. So, and I know with photographers, it's a lot about having beautiful images, right? And of course you want to like help them identify. So it could even be where you're showing like what style resonates the most with you. And maybe you have 3 different types of images that show 3 different types of like wedding photography, like that would be interesting to people. So they see right off the bat, like, oh, look at this photographer offers these different styles. And this is a style that really resonates with me. So you can do that. You can also do that same stuff on social media too, right? Like helping people identify. The other thing about social media is it's pretty rare that people just like randomly come across your social media. Like they're probably searching or they've started following you in some way. So chances are you've already made a first impression. So that introduction stage, it's already done. So what's the next stage then? It's to create curiosity. And we have to be able to create curiosity. And one of the easiest ways to create social or curiosity on social media is by asking a question that makes somebody want to dig deeper to like see what the answer is. So there's this term, it's called instinctive elaboration. And it's this idea that if we are asked a question, our brain immediately wants to answer. Our brains are like Google. If you go to Google right now and you type in anything, Google tries to give you an answer. Even if it doesn't always get the right answer, it tries to give you an answer. Our brains are the same way. So one of the mistakes that people make on social media is they do a lot of talking at. They talk about like, here's this wedding that I did this weekend, or, here's this type of photo shoot that's available. But instead, if you ask somebody a question of like, what's your favorite photo from this batch of photos? Now somebody wants to look at the photos and like answer the question. Now, it doesn't mean that they'll necessarily comment, but they're more likely to comment if you ask them a question.
I love that. And then, like, obviously on social media, there's a lot of, like, posts and, like, imagery and stuff to do. When it comes to, like, copy on a website, because I know copy is, like, a really big thing, what would you say are, like, ways you can do that? Just, like, what woven out throughout the copy of someone's website? Like, how do you know, like, what types of questions are going to help create that curiosity or elements to, like, include to kind of help guide them through that curiosity phase?
Well, one is that the messaging and the language and the, your written stuff there on your website, it needs to be you statements to the reader. And so this kind of goes back to a mistake. A lot of times, we have thoughts and so we write them. So we write from our perspective, but your perspective isn't interesting to the reader because they don't know and love you yet, right? So what's interesting to them is their perspective. So one of the big mistakes that people make is you'll go onto their website and it's riddled with I statements. I wish this for you. I want that for you. I do this. That's not interesting to somebody who doesn't know you yet. They're like, I don't care what you wish for me. I don't care what you want for me. And I don't really care what you do yet. What I want to know is, how does this impact me? Because I always say, like, most of us, we think the whole world revolves around us, right? Like each one of us as individuals, we think everything that happens is happening for me, to me, or against me. And so we gotta engage the brain of the reader. So instead of making I statements, you would have you statements. So instead of saying, I want this for you, I want you to have beautiful wedding photos, you could ask a question. It could be something like, what is your criteria for beautiful wedding photos? Well, now their brain wants to answer that question. That's interesting to them because that's about their criteria. So we can't just have I statements riddled through this is one of the things I offer to my clients is I do a lot of rewrites for them. I tweak their messages after they write them. And the biggest, I'm going to say offender is these I statements. So here's kind of my rule around this is if you have, let's say, 10 sentences and you go and you look at these 10 sentences that you've written, count your number of I statements and compare it to the number of sentences. You might be surprised that oftentimes people, I'll look at this, I'll go, okay, there's 10 sentences, there's 15 I statements in there. That's not interesting to a reader. So my rule usually is it needs to follow the 80-20 rule. So 80% of your messaging should be you statements and formed in a lot of times in questions. And then you could have 2 I statements, because I know grammatically, like sometimes we have to have an I statement. And when you're talking about like your bio, of course there's going to be an I statement, unless you're talking about yourself in third party, but still, right? The rest of the time, it should be you statements. It should be questions. It should be engaging the brain of the prospect.
I love that. And I think it really does get people curious. And I loved how you were just bringing up anytime someone like gets asked a question or is prompted with a question, they need to answer it. Just like sometimes you hear the start of a song and you need to finish the lyrics when you know it. And so I think it's so interesting that like using that as a way to kind of like guide them through that process in a powerful way. Because like we said, like we're not trying to like manipulate or do anything like salesy or slimy. Like we're just truly trying to make sure that they don't miss what it is that we have to offer. And you want them to make sure that they're like actually curiously invested in that. So I think that's really interesting. And so I'd also love to talk a little bit more about like kind of what that looks like in the consult or like discovery phase. So like I know that you kind of mentioned the 2 different types of things you need to do. You need to figure out like first if they're the right fit, but then also plant seeds about like your expertise. Would you be able to walk through like maybe a couple more examples of like what that could look like, or you know what it could look like doing it really well versus really bad, like kind of what the difference is and how to know?
Well, again, the idea in that part of the conversation, in that discovery phase, is to ask smart questions. And just a qualifier here is that the questions you ask should only allow for you to identify, yes, I'm talking to the right person, and yes, I have an offer. Like that's what we're kind of going for, and get them interested in wanting to hear the offer. One mistake people often make is they ask a bunch of questions that they only need those answers once the person hires them. So you waste that precious time of trying to earn somebody's business by asking them a bunch of questions and overwhelming them with things that you really only need the answers to these questions once the person hires you. So for instance, I know for me, when I'm talking to a prospective client, a question I would never ask somebody is, what's your email size and how often do you email your list? Now, once you're a client, I want to know that because we're going to talk about how do we sell through your email list. But I don't need to know that in a discovery call, because that's not going to impact whether or not you're an ideal client. What I do need to know is, do you know how to create curiosity when you're talking about your products and your services? Now, that is an expertise planning question, because most people, their answer to that is like, no, but it also implies like Nikki's asking me this question. Chances are she's asking me this question because she can show me how to do this. So that would be an example of that. And then another really basic question that I think people get afraid to ask is the budget question. Like, what's your budget for this project, or what are you looking to invest? And a lot of times people, I find, especially if you're not that comfortable with sales, is that you're afraid to ask the question because you're afraid that they're going to think your prices are too high, or that they're not going to want to buy from you if you know, you ask them that question. Or I often hear too is people say, well, people won't answer that question. They never have an answer. Well, chances are we just need to tweak the way you're asking the question, because I can get an answer out of most people for that question. So sometimes it's like you could give a range. You could say, typically a project like this, or a photo shoot is going to range somewhere between X and Y. Where do you fall in that range? Now, the reason you need to know that question is because if you say, a photo shoot is going to range somewhere between $5,000 and $20,000, where do you fall in that range? And they go, oh, I was only looking to spend $500. Well, now we know pretty quickly that we're talking to somebody who is probably not a good fit for us, because we don't do a photo shoot for $500. So we're going to bless and release those people as fast as possible, so as to not waste their time, but also not to waste yours talking to people who are never going to buy. So we have to ask the budget question. That's one of those like identifier questions of like, are you talking to the right person? Because if they're not willing to invest, they are not your ideal client, and you have to bless and release.
Totally. And I think any photographer or anyone who offers any sort of service that requires like these consult calls, we've all been there. We've spent the time talking to someone and then only to find out like, oh, this is not in the budget for them. And then it makes both parties feel bad, like wasted time, but then also someone feeling like, man, I like, you both feel like you wasted each other's time, and it's like sad. I guess like a question too, like I know everyone is different and everyone has different philosophies on this, but do you think that the website is a place to like have some sort of like precursor or indicator about pricing, or do you wait for those consult calls to have them first see or hear a number from you?
Okay, so this is usually one of those places where it can be a little controversial, my answer. I absolutely think you should have pricing on your website. Now, when I say that, there's a couple caveats here. Sometimes people say like, well, Nikki, I just say prices start at. That's a mistake. Because when you say prices start at, you just anchored your lowest price. So if you quote them a higher price, they're disappointed. But if you say prices range, and you give a range, if you're like, well, I can't give my exact package pricing because I tailor it for every client or whatever, then give a range. And I don't care what the range is. I don't care if you say it ranges from $10 to $10,000. You have to give a range. But I do prefer that you have pricing on your website. And I will say over the years, I've worked with many photographers. I have a very, very successful photographer that I've worked with. And when we first started working together, somebody had said to her, like, don't list pricing on your website, which, I explained, like, this is a mistake and here's why. And we were actually in a training together. She was at an event where I was doing like an all-day training. And we were talking about this pricing on the website. And I was explaining why one of the reasons you want to put pricing on your website is because if you think that somebody's going to call you because you don't have pricing and that's going to give you an opportunity to earn their business, which I think a lot of business coaches say, which is baloney, that they're saying that because it makes you feel good. They're not saying that because it's going to help your business. Because if you make people call you to ask your price, you're already putting them in an awkward position because now they have to like call and be vulnerable. And if you quote, if they're wanting to spend $5,000 and you start at 12, now they feel like, oh, I wasted this person's time and now I'm embarrassed because I can't afford their services. That's not how you want to start a conversation with somebody. So back to this training, having this conversation, my photographer client was in the room. And at the break, one of my clients came up and she was like, I'm so glad that you talked about this. She's like, I've been wanting to do a photo shoot with this photographer who's in the room. She's like, I waited for 2 years because I didn't know if I could afford her. And it wasn't until one of my friends had a photo shoot with her and found out about her pricing that allowed me to go, oh, I can afford that. And so I explained that to my client, and now she puts pricing on everything. It's like there's no reason to hide your price. You should be proud of who you are and what you offer. And if you think that people are going to just like flock to you because you don't have your pricing, you're actually doing the opposite. You're repelling people who will just keep searching and find people who do have pricing on their website.
I think that's so great. Honestly, the examples you just laid out there are, I think, exactly why I'm really glad that we're talking about this, because it's so easy to just do what everyone else is doing, but then not actually think through how does this impact the other person and how does this actually impact the clients that we're trying to serve really well, and it's actually a disservice to them. Because the industry standard is like either putting out starting up price or not doing that at all. And I think what you just said about like doing the range, that's such a good and easily missed thing. Now, okay, before we jump into the next thing, I'm curious though, the logistics of it. So do you recommend like having like a specific pricing section, like where you talk about the range, or having it on like the contact submit form? Like where do you recommend making sure that this is something that they don't miss when they actually like inquire with you?
First and foremost, if you have a page for your different like wedding packages, for instance, then you would put that pricing for each package on your website. Now, here's a kicker, is that you need to list your packages top down. So that means your most expensive package has to be listed first, then your middle, then your, bottom tier. I do only recommend having like 3 sections of pricing on a specific page, not like here's a whole price list with, 25 different pricing. That's super overwhelming to somebody's brain. They're going to have a hard time like processing that. So top-down selling, really, really important. This is critical for people to make good decisions about what's the right package for them versus it's a difference between trying to convince somebody to pay more for something to get more, when actually our brains actually prefer that. They don't want to have things taken away. So if you start at the top with like, here's the full meal package, so you get everything, you know, your video and your photography, and this is the package, then their brain could go like, oh man, if I want to save money, I have to give things up. It's a very different mentality. So top-down pricing, that's first and foremost. And then if you don't want to list your exact pricing, then again, you could have a range. You could just say prices, you know, packages range between X and Y. And then you could kind of explain what's included in certain packages. And then if you have it on your contact form, here's my thing about this is it kind of depends on if you feel like you're getting a lot of tire kicker consults, like people who are never going to buy from you because they can't really afford you, then you probably do want there to be a question, like that initial questionnaire you might ask them to fill out. And in there, you would say, prices range between X and Y. Where do you fall in this range for, you know, what you're looking to accomplish? Like, that's all you need. And then that way, if you're getting a bunch of people who are getting on calls with you and you're saying, you know, prices are $5,000 to $20,000, and they're like, oh, I was looking to spend $500. Like, you don't have to take a call with somebody who answers $500. You can respectfully decline to have that call with them, or you can check in with them about it. I put pricing on my website, like my pricing is listed. Not every single price for every single thing I sell is on my website, because not everything I sell is on my website, because I have a lot of different offers and I'm not trying to overwhelm people with different things, but like, here's the main core offers with pricing. And then when we get on a call, I'm going to ask about the pricing, like the budget or what they're looking to invest to accomplish, you know, XYZ, because it helps me kind of determine what I'm going to recommend for them.
And I just think like it can look so different for everyone. Like, yeah, do you have all of them listed on your website? Do you have just the range? Do you have a starting at? I love though that you're just drawing attention to the fact that we need to start somewhere with them and like help them feel like, okay, yeah, this is something that is within what I can do before wasting anyone's time. So I think that was definitely worth the little tangent there for sure. But thank you so much for that. Kind of diving back in. So I know we kind of talked a little bit about like the discovery and like trying to talk through like the wants, needs, and like what we need to figure out to like learn from that. In terms of like the proposal, what are some of the biggest mistakes you see people making when they're like going through the actual proposal phase? So they've determined that this person's a good fit. They have something that they can offer. It's time to propose. What would you say is like the biggest miss?
The biggest miss is that they don't ask permission before they go into that. Because if somebody's not ready to hear about your offers, they're going to shut down and you're kind of wasting your time and energy and breath, frankly. So once you have identified through the discovery, yes, this is an ideal client. Yes, I have an idea for them. Then you're going to say, based on what you shared, I do have a recommendation for you on a way that we could work together. Or based on what you shared, I have a few ideas of ways that we could work together. Are you ready to hear about those? Or would you like to hear about those now? Then you wait, you let them answer. Now, next thing is when you're going to propose something, remember, you're the expert. Your job is to recommend the right solution that fits their needs. And sometimes the fits the needs might not fit the budget, but you still should be recommending like the package that's going to give them what it is that they're looking for. Now, you might need to recommend a less expensive package that's more in their budget and give them some choice. When you do that, never recommend more than 3 options. Always do top-down selling. So start with the most expensive product or solution first and then work your way down. And then make sure that when you're talking about your product or your solution, your package, that you're specifically referencing how it addresses the needs that they've talked about in their discovery. So using their keywords and phrases. Here's like a super random example from a photographer that I worked with years ago. She was telling me that, you know, she got these, like she was constantly getting really great inquiries to her website. And then she was getting on calls with clients, but she was not closing a certain type of client. She was explaining like, I get a tremendous amount of inquiries from this type of client, but then they never close, and I can't figure out why. And so we dug into it a little bit, and it turned out that one of the things I asked her is, now when this type of client is calling you, how do they refer to what it is that you offer? And she said they call my products pictures. And I said, what do you call them? She's like, photos. I'm a photographer. And I was like, okay, you need to call them pictures, because that word means something to this type of person. And you're still talking about the same thing, but you trying to be like, well, I'm a photographer and I call my stuff photos, or, whatever. It's like, it doesn't matter what you call it. It matters what they call it. And making that tiny shift, now she's speaking right to the heart of the person that is interested in what it is that she offers. So don't be so caught up in like, here's my feeds and speeds of my products and use my language. No, my language is never as powerful as the language that the prospect will give and what they call things, unless there's some like, you need to qualify, like, what do they mean when they say that? Otherwise, use their keywords. It's kind of like, if you go to another country and their language is a different language than, what we speak here in the US, which is English. It's really gross to go to somebody else's country and be like, hey, I speak English. Does anybody here speak English? Because if you don't speak English, like, I don't want to buy from you, or I don't want to, go to your restaurant. Like, that's so offensive to that country when they're like, you're in our country, like, gross, ugly Americans. Don't be a gross, ugly American when you're talking to a prospect. Speak their language, because it matters and they care.
And I love that so much. And, it's interesting that you bring up the like photo or photograph versus picture, because I think also people have in their mind how they're branding themselves, like maybe to a photographer that maybe does a little bit more high end, they call it photographs. Maybe other people don't use that in their everyday language, but that's like how they brand it on their website and stuff. No, maybe it is speaking to a different client, maybe it's not, but I do love how like you're just like bringing it back to that conversation, and like when you're in those consult calls and when you're actually like going through the process of, proposing to them, using their language and like making them feel seen. And I think that's just such like a intentional way to do that. So I love that. I love that so much. Okay, so let's talk about the last section, the close. I think this is the one where a lot of people maybe freeze or get a little nervous because they're like, I don't want someone to say no. And they just kind of like, okay, here, do this if you want. You can book me if you want, but like just decide later. Like, I've seen that happen. We've all done that. What are you seeing in terms of the close, like big mistakes and like big shifts that can help people improve that for themselves?
Well, one of the biggest mistakes is that if you're not comfortable with the pricing and you're not comfortable with closing because you don't want to come off as salesy and you don't close, which like people are like, I just want to get off the phone and send them an email that has the pricing and then they can click the link if they want to buy. That's a mistake. And the reason it's a mistake is because when you have somebody's attention right then and there, like it's like precious, and you need to honor it, because getting anybody's attention right now, just think about you and like an average day for you. On like average day for you, how many decisions do you think you make a day? Like just throw out a number. And for anybody listening, like come up with your own number too. Like just throw out a number.
Man, I feel like we're in the hundreds. It's a lot.
100. Okay. They say that the average adult makes between 30 and 60,000 decisions every single day. Wow. So when you get somebody off a call and you just want to send them an email that has pricing that they can decide, you are saying to them, hey, put this decision behind the other 30,000 decisions that you need to make. Put it on your to-do list. And so you're not making it easy for them to make a decision, and you're not making it easy for them to buy. And frankly, we have decision fatigue, like it's a real thing. And if we don't have to decide something in a moment, oftentimes we'll postpone it, but then we postpone it like to our detriment, right? It's like, how many times do I think like, oh, I really need to make an appointment to have my teeth cleaned, but like, I don't really want to stop what I'm doing today to make that appointment. So a month goes by and I'm like, I really need to, like get into see my dentist. So all you're doing is postponing something for them and keeping them from getting what it is that they said they wanted. So your job is to put the decision in front of them, make it super easy for them to decide. Doesn't mean that they'll necessarily always buy, but if you say to somebody, here's the proposal or here's my recommendation for you, and then you follow up with close language, is that something you'd like to go ahead and get scheduled? Or is that something you'd like to get booked? Or is that something is that something you would like to move forward with? Like, these are all different types of close language. Now you're saying to their brain, you're triggering their brain to go ahead. This is the easiest time for you to make a decision. And when you do that, there's like one of 5 things that will happen when you put a close statement in front of somebody. They'll either say yes, awesome, you got a new client, that's fantastic. They'll ask a question, that's the second thing. And frankly, most people are like one question away from hiring you. And if you don't give them the opportunity to ask you that question, it's very hard to earn their business. So by issuing close language, it allows for their brain to come up with that question that they need answered. So great, you answer the question, you close again. So you would answer the question and then you say, so based on that, is this something you're ready to move forward with? The third thing that will happen is they'll voice an objection. And we need to know what the objection is, because you can never overcome an objection that you don't know what it is. So we need to know if there's something that's hindering them or keeping them from moving forward. And then the fourth thing that they'll do is they might say no, they might decline. Okay, well, that's good to know too, because now it gives us an opportunity to ask, is it okay if I ask your reason for declining? Because that might give you some really great information. And it also allows you to not spend time and energy chasing somebody who's not going to buy from you. Like, bless and release the person who says no. And then the last thing, the fifth thing that will sometimes happen is they'll say they need to think about it, or they need to consult with their partner or whatever, right? And this is one of those like big key places that people make a big mistake, is they go, oh, okay, well, think about it and I'll follow up with you next week. It's like, no. If somebody says they need to think about it, then you say, great, about how much time do you think you'll need? Let's go ahead and schedule a circle back call now on our calendars. That way I can answer any additional questions that come up for you. And then we can decide about next steps for working together. And then you get a time scheduled on their calendar and yours. And now you don't have to spend a bunch of time and energy thinking, should I send them an email today? What should I write in the email? No, because you're like, oh, we're going to talk on Thursday at 10. Done.
Easy. I love that. I love how you just like walked that through. And yeah, it's actually pretty similar to like a lot of like what we do is like trying to make sure that we create that space, give them the information, but also that space to process it. And it's kind of like keeping the ball, right? Like when you kind of release the ball, you don't hope it's going to ever come back to you, or you're just going to get kind of like a less connected, like, sorry, we went a different direction, and you're never going to be able to like kind of connect with them or know why. And you might still get that. But when you kind of have that follow up and they're like, wow, the time was valuable and I really do genuinely care, like they're not going to cancel that meeting if they actually are wanting to like work with you. Like they might actually just need and appreciate that time. So I love that. I think that's super, super good. Okay, Nikki, is there any last like information or advice you want to leave our listeners with just before we kind of close out today?
Most people are afraid to ask people for their business, and please don't be, because it truly is just an invitation, and most people like to be invited. I don't know about you, but if you knew like your neighbor was throwing a party and all the neighbors around you got an invite, but you didn't, you would probably feel a little bit out of shape, even if you didn't want to go. So most people like to be invited. So don't be afraid to ask somebody to move forward or to work with you, or, is there ever an opportunity where you'd be interested in doing a photo shoot with me? Like, it's okay to ask people for their business. And then you just take that information that they give back. And a lot of times it's planting a seed. I can't tell you how many times I've asked somebody like, are you interested in getting some support around sales? And they're like, no, I don't think so. And then, 2 months later, sometimes 2 years later, sometimes 5 years later, they show up and they're like, Nikki, I've been thinking about the time that you talked to me about that. And I've been thinking I really needed some help with sales. So here I am. I'm ready. I'm ready to move forward with you. So sometimes it's just planting a seed, and that's okay too. But don't be afraid to ask people for their business. Very few people are going to clutch their pearls and be like, oh, how dare you ask me for my business, right? Like, they'll be okay with it. And you can just move on in the conversation. If they say like, no, I'm not interested in a photo shoot. Great. Just keep the conversation going. It's not a big deal.
Okay, I love that so much. And Nikki, this has been just such a great conversation. For people who are interested in learning more about you and potentially working with you, where can they find you and what types of things do you offer?
I'm going to wrap it around a gift for your audience. So this will be a way for us to get connected. I have an ebook. It's called Closing the Sale, and it's all about building your confidence in those kind of last 3 steps of the sales conversation. So I would love to gift it to your audience. You can get it by going to yoursalesmaven.com/shot. So this is for your audience. So yoursalesmaven.com/shot. You'll get the ebook, Closing the Sale. It's all about boosting your confidence, like I said. And then, I have my own podcast, which is Sales Maven. If you're a podcast listener, which obviously you are, if you want some more support around sales. And I work with clients kind of in three main ways. I do private coaching one-on-one with people. I have a group coaching program that you get live calls with me in a group setting, and you get access to my training center. And then I have kind of a DIY resource hub that's called the Sales Maven Studio. The group coaching program, by the way, is called the Sales Maven Society. So those are kind of the three ways that I work. Specifically, I work with quite a few photographers, actually. I love photographers. So if I can support you in some way, if you're struggling in some area around sales, if your packages aren't resonating and you want some help on refining those packages, or if your consults aren't going the way that you want them to go, or like, those are the times where we could work together in a one-on-one setting for sure and like refine that for you.
Amazing. Seriously, Nikki, thank you just so much for all your time. And for everyone listening, take a look at the show notes. We've got everything linked below so you can easily find Nikki and figure out more of like how you can work with her. And for sure, please download that ebook because there's a lot there. I know where I'm heading after this. So thank you so much, and we'll see you guys next week.